Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with Part 2, Masonic Foundation of Masonic Orders of Fraternity by Manly P. Hall. The Adepts, Masonic Orders of Fraternity. Masonic Foundations. Masonic historians have traced the origins of their order with proper patience and diligence, if not with complete success. The disagreements of learned authorities over the descent of the operative and speculative traditions of the craft need not be examined here. Societies of skilled artisans, addicted to those arts and sciences concerned with architecture and ornamentation, certainly have flourished from the beginning of historical time. Possibly such associations originated in the ancient practice of perpetuating the secrets of a profession or trade within families. According to 18th century Masonic tradition, Rome gathered the most eminent professors and practitioners of the arts and sciences until they advanced to their zenith of glory under Augustus Caesar, in whose reign was born God's Messiah, the great architect of the church, who, having laid the world quiet by proclaiming universal peace, highly encouraged those dexterous artists that had been bred in the Roman liberty, and their learned scholars and pupils, but particularly the great Vitruvius, the father of all true architects to this day. Therefore, it is rationally believed that the glorious Augustus became the Grand Master of the Lodge at Rome, having, besides his patronizing Vitruvius, much promoted the welfare of his fellow craftsmen, as appears by the magnificent buildings of his reign, etc. See the Constitutions of the Freemasons, etc. by James Anderson, London, 1723. After the collapse of the Roman College of Architects, the splendid trade of the builders passed to the keeping of the Great Order of Commissene Masters, which flourished during the reigns of Constantine and Theodosius. The Magistrae Commissii was composed of members of the Roman Collegia, who, escaping from the barbarians when they overran the empire, established themselves on the fortified island of Commissena in Lake Como. Here they preserved the secret traditions of architecture and the machinery of the Roman guilds. They were responsible for the development of early Lombard and Romanesque styles of ornamentation. The Commissenes were divided into masters and disciples and were ruled by a Grand Master. Their meeting places were called logia. They wore white aprons and gloves and had signs, tokens, passwords, and other means of identification. The 4 crowned martyrs were the patron saints of the Commissene builders. These martyrs were members of the College of Architects in Rome. During the reign of Diocletian, they had been converted to Christianity and steadfastly refused to fashion a statue of Aesculapius. These masters and 1 apprentice were tortured to death by order of the emperor. The 4 crowned martyrs, carrying builders' instruments, were pictured or referenced to in many early religious and Masonic writings, including the Regius MS. The Courtier Coordinati Lodge, London, the most distinguished Masonic research group, was named in honor of these martyrs. The Commissene Masters supplied the important link between the pagan artificers and the Christian cathedral builders. While it is difficult to prove the historical descent of an initiate order of adept architects, Hecathorn summarizes the situation with reasonable accuracy. In antiquity, there were cooperations of architects and engineers who undertook the building of temples and stadia. The Dionysiacs in Greek, the Collegium Moriorum in Rome were such. They were the prototypes of the associations of masons, builders, carpenters, who in the Middle Ages flourished, chiefly in Germany and England. These, sometimes numbering 600 to 800 members, made contracts with monks, chapters, and other ecclesiastical authorities for the erection of cathedrals or churches. Evidently, they made themselves independent of the church, and in the 13th century, they formed an extensive building association, originating at Cologne and having lodges, as they called the directing members, at Strasbourg, Vienna, Cologne, and Zurich. There were other lodges, but these were the most important. They called themselves Freemasons and had ceremonies of initiation. Towards the end of the 16th century, non-operative Masons were admitted into the fraternity, who were called Accepted Masons. They included men distinguished for learning or high position. Thus, the work in the lodges became more symbolic than operative. C. Secret societies of all ages. Assemblies of men specially skilled in architecture descended from antiquity and flourished in both Europe and Asia. These guilds of artisans were called upon whenever it was resolved to build new cities, to erect monumental structures, or to restore or enlarge shrines, temples, and palaces. Originally, these artisans migrated in groups of various numbers. According to the requirements of the occasion, they gathered wherever an elaborate architecture project was in progress and moved on to new locales when the work was finished. According to Hughes, Archbishop of Rouen, numerous companies of such Masons, under the leadership of a chief whom they normally called a prince, were traveling about Normandy, restoring churches in the year 1145. He also mentioned that these artificers held an important guild union at Chartres, which was a splendid affair. It was considered indelicate to inquire into the secrets of these associations of builders. Apparently, they combined religious and philosophical speculations with the more prosaic rules of construction. The normal boundaries of prevailing racial and religious prejudices were relaxed in favor of these skilled bands of craftsmen, who were permitted to live according to their natural instincts and preferences while laboring in various districts and counties. Great edifices, such as the cathedral churches, often required centuries to complete. Thus, several generations of artisans were employed on a single project, and the camps or towns which they established contiguous to their work became comparatively permanent communities. Like the gypsies, these bands of wandering craftsmen never mingled with other people. If some feudal lord wished to enlarge his castle or build a church, his desires were circulated quietly but thoroughly by the troubadours or other wandering entertainers. Shortly, a body of Freemasons assembled near the prospective site. These men immediately placed themselves under the rule of a master elected from among their number, and he, in turn, nominated one man out of every 10 as a warden. First, they erected temporary huts for their use, and then a central lodge for their meetings. Sometimes they stipulated that the townsfolk should provide tiles to roof this lodge, also white aprons of a particular kind of leather and gloves to protect their hands from lime and stone. The craftsmen assembled in their lodge at the beginning of each day's work, and if they required rough labor from the vicinity, they did not admit these workmen to the principal assembly. See Freemasonry and the Ancient Gods by J.S.M. Ward, London, 1921. The members of these associations of builders were governed by their own duly elected chiefs. Frequently, they gave no allegiance to the temporal power which paid their wages. The workmen brought with them not only their families and worldly goods, but also their cultural institutions. These remained comparatively uninfluenced by outside pressures, for not frequently the workmen did not even speak the dialect of the area in which they labored. The chiefs, or lodge masters, contracted to perform and complete the program of work, and often certain skilled men among them also designed the building or corrected and revised plans submitted to them by the ecclesiastical or civil authorities. Thus it came about that the early church employed pagan artisans or those of doubtful orthodoxy when some elaborate structure was required. So great was the power of these builders' associations, and so urgently was their skill required, that it was deemed advisable to ignore religious nonconformity. Probably, the issue was never raised, at least publicly, as the artificers assumed an outward appearance of conformity and declined to disclose any of their secret beliefs or convictions. These fraternities of craftsmen were privately addicted to the doctrines of Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and Manichaeism. Later, they were influenced by the Lollards and the much persecuted Templars, but, like their troubadours, they had learned discretion in the school of sad experience. Men can learn by observation, and early monks with natural aptitudes were able, by degrees, to absorb the essential principles of the science of architecture. At first, these clerics only attempted structures of minor importance, but as their skill increased, they fraternized with the old associations and, having given evidence of merit and proficiency, in some instances were actually initiated. This new order of monastic artisans imbibed some of the old philosophy along with the more practical aspects of the craft, and became perpetuators of the old learning in its twofold descent as theory and practice. In Saxon and Norman England, a number of early priests have been identified as architects and masons. These Christian builders perpetuated the apprenticeship system of the ancient orders as the most practical means of preserving the high standards of the building arts. It is difficult at this late time to differentiate between such Christian and non-Christian guilds of masons, and it is doubtful if much would be accomplished by reopening the issue. Names change, but the principles continue without noticeable alteration. Traces of secret societies can be discovered among the ruins of Aboriginal cultures, and such groups still flourish among primitive peoples. Numerous authorities have attempted to show that these cults use symbols and rituals similar to those found in Freemasonry. The writings of Augustus Lipojan, especially his secret mysteries among the Mayans and Kishis, and the researches of James Church Ward, as set forth in Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, are examples of this approach. While such parallels undoubtedly exist and may be regarded as interesting, they only have an indirect bearing upon the modern fraternity. It is a moot question as to how much of the esoteric tradition was preserved among the guilds of operative masons through that long, dark period from the collapse of the pagan mysteries to the appearance of philosophic masonry in Europe in the early 17th century. In fact, it has not been possible to prove to the complete satisfaction of skeptics that any body of abstract or esoteric lore was directly transmitted from the early collegia to the modern fraternity. There must be more than shows on the surface, but unless the Masonic historian is aware of the essential substance of the adept tradition, he will find the facts extremely elusive. The deficiencies of history have resulted in the popular belief that Freemasonry is a modern society tied to antiquity only by the fortuitous adoption of certain ancient signs and symbols. Working guilds, such as the cathedral builders, took a lively interest in religious, political, and social issues outside the strict limits of their crafts. The artificers had enjoyed extraordinary privileges of self-government for more than 20 centuries. Within their own groups, they had developed a merit system of mutual cooperation and protection in sharp contrast with the corruptions everywhere observed in the conduct of civil affairs. They had attained to a practical democracy for themselves, while Europe was still in bondage to economic and political feudalism. There can be no doubt that the guilds cherished the spirit of real democracy and became proficient in the operations of what is now called the merit system, long before it was generally recognized as a possible political pattern. Joseph Fort Newton held that Freemasonry did not evolve from guild masonry. He writes, "Freemasons existed in large numbers long before any city guild of masons was formed, and even after the guilds became powerful, the two were entirely distinct." See the Builders, Cedar Rapids, 1916, and other dates. This author believed that the guilds were fraternities by voluntary compact, characterized by the common banquet and the common purpose. He acknowledged, however, that they also had a religious and sometimes a secret ceremonial to knit more firmly the bonds of fidelity. According to him, the Freemasons were a superior group that occasionally hired rough masons from the guilds as hewers of wood and carriers of water. This attitude assumes that the guilds were little more than trade or labor unions, benevolent and protective associations. This may be true after the guilds were settled in the community life of Europe and England, and the stolid burghers meet in the guild halls to regulate their respective trades. By that time, most of the esoteric lore survived only as a vague symbolism, but the guilds, as respectable trade associations, were the terminal forms of ancient and honorable institutions of initiates. The English miracle plays were mentioned by Dugdale in his History of Warwickshire, published in 1656. Such details as he was able to secure were given to him by aged persons who still remembered the plays which they had seen in their younger years. The importance of the pageants given on Corpus Christi Day may be inferred from the quality of the audience. Richard III attended in 1483, and Henry VII and his queen in 1492. Apparently, the pageants were no longer presented in the time of Dugdale. The miracle plays, sometimes presented by the Grey Friars and sometimes by the local guilds, originated in the rituals of the Greek mysteries. These were revived in Rome, and Christian stories were later substituted for the myths of the pagan gods. Such theatrical performances were morality dramas rather than historical accounts, and supplied a pattern for the ritualistic presentations now associated with the initiation rites of secret societies. From Old England, London, 1854. The performance of a dramatic mystery at Coventry. Concerning these religious plays presented in England at any early date, Thomas Sharp writes, "Besides the mysteries exhibited by the monks of Chester and Coventry, there were in both cities certain sacred histories regularly performed by and at the expense of the members of the trade guilds established in them, each society generally retaining to itself a particular portion of scripture for the subject of the annual drama, to the support of which all the brethren duly paid. Thus, at Chester, the tanners represented the fall of Lucifer, the drapers, the creation, the dryers, the deluge, etc. And at Coventry, the shearmen played the nativity, and the cappers, the resurrection, and descent into hell. See Dissertation on the Pageants, or Dramatic Mysteries, anciently performed at Coventry by the trading companies of that city. Coventry, 1825. It seems possible that rituals later associated with the degrees of Freemasonry may have been suggested by those guild dramas. If so, the building of Solomon's Temple would have been a most appropriate theme for the companies of stonemasons. Even after the guilds had been integrated into the social structure of early modern Europe, they still practiced a code of ethics in advance of their time, in a limited way, but with a considerable sphere of quiet influence. These societies, unions, and crafts sponsored progress and liberal enterprise. Protective associations were also formed to maintain fair standards of merchandising, and to protect their members and the members of affiliate organizations from unfair business practices. While this side of the subject has been emphasized, the pattern of internal government which became a model for a larger social experiment in the political sphere should not be overlooked. At least some guild masons were aware that their ancient brethren practiced their craft as forms of religious worship. The ethical symbolism of modern Freemasonry, which interprets the processes of architecture as representing the upbuilding of human character, was shared by the medieval artificers. In an anonymous work titled The Echo of the Divinely Illuminated Fraternity of the R.C., published in 1615, appears the statement that Christ established a new college of magic among his disciples, and the greater mysteries were revealed to St. John and St. Paul. Dr. Robert Flood mentioned that the Rosicrucians were wise men who, like architects, erected their house of wisdom. The Talmud states that wise men are called builders because they are always engaged in the upbuilding of the world. The members of the Essene sect among the Jews were called bonaim, or builders, because it was their duty to edify or protect the spiritual temple in the body of man. It cannot be assumed that the building associations were entirely unaware of their religious, ethical, and moral obligations. While the secrets of the esoteric tradition may have been in the keeping of an overgroup, the guild craftsmen certainly represented the material aspect of a spiritual conviction. John Yarker, who held important Masonic offices and received many high honors from the craft, crams much useful information into a sentence of heroic proportions. We cannot doubt that the epochtae, or higher initiates, of the first ages of Christianity transmitted their mystical rites. These were taken up and carried forward by monks, dervishes, Manichaeans, Cathari, Templars, Albigenses, Ghibellines, Friends of God, Militia of the Cross, Rosicrucians, and sects too numerous to mention, and that such secret schools were in existence long prior to the Reformation in the Church, as witness the labors of such men as Pico de Mirandillo, Roy Clean, Erasmus, Agrippa, Randolphus Agricola, and many more, and that educated Freemasons in their masters' fraternities and fellow craft lodges were more or less conversant with Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Kabbalism, Rosicrucianism, and that these societies interested themselves in Germany and elsewhere in the spread of the doctrine of the Kelders, of Wycliffe, Huss, Luther, and other reformers, and the secret society established in Cornelius Agrippa in London in 1510 may have been of this nature. See the Arcane Schools, Belfast, 1908. Many of the organized craftsmen of the Middle Ages were nominal Christians, in many respects outstanding for their personal piety and devotion. They differed principally in the degree and quality of their interpretations of the Christian dispensation. In a day of almost continuous strife and conspiracy, they dwelt together in cooperation and amity. These associations had discovered a working formula for the practice of liberty, equality, and charity. The guilds continued as important forces in character building until machine production terminated the apprenticeship system. These conscientious and dedicated craftsmen devised and practiced an ethical code which became a design, or trestle board, for the accepted Masons who followed them. In philosophic Masonry, master builders, inspired by the symbols of fraternity, resolved to perfect the everlasting house of human brotherhood. The true spirit of modern Masonry arose when these guild artisans first recognized the possibility of applying the rules of the architectural unions and other trade guilds to society in general. For this reason, no exact dating is possible. Rather, there was a gradual emergence of a sincere conviction into the light of a larger sphere of usefulness. The Protestant Reformation contributed a great deal to the growth of the democratic ideals, and received in its turn comfort and security from at least the spirit of the guilds. Yarker suggests that secret schools, broadly Gnostic in their convictions, must have permeated the whole of Europe and entered into the guild life of the traders and artisans. Otherwise, it is impossible to account for the spontaneous support given to the Reformation. It is supposed, writes Yarker, that Luther himself was a guild member, and he actually used these guild terms in 1527 when he says that he is already past master in clock making. It is stated that about 15 days after the Holocaust, which he had the temerity to make of the Pope's bull, He was waited upon by a member of some guild holding a meeting at Wittenberg and induced to go to an assembly at the guild hall, where, after reception, by ancient ceremonies, he received a medal bearing mystic characters and was then placed under the protection of the Brotherhood. It is quite certain that secret societies of mystics, united by ceremonies with signs, then existed, and it may be that the reformers strengthened themselves by such societies, intended for mutual protection, and the Charter of Cologne, 1535, if genuine, may represent such assemblies. Derived from National Freemason, Washington, 1863, Rose Masonic Biographies, 1868, and Canada's Craftsman, 1893. After the Reformation, Europe passed through a critical transition period. Traditionally, authority was seriously undermined, and the masses were divided in their allegiances between fear of the old and hope for the new. The partnership between the church and state, having lost much of its prestige, was unable to dominate, much less destroy, the new convictions everywhere revealing themselves. The Protestant denominations shared many of the concepts which had been fostered by the guilds, so these two groups drifted into closer sympathy, causing a demarcation between the forces of reaction and innovation in the spheres of both religious and social convictions. This summary of an elaborate and extensive progress is sufficient to introduce the rite of philosophic or speculative masonry as distinguished from the operative guilds. Historians assume the shift of foundations to have occurred about the year 1600, although it required some time to clarify and integrate the new concepts. The dawn of the 17th century, a time so burdened with great and significant motions, was the birth time of accepted masonry. The burden of progress was shifted from the physical to the ethical level, and the builders of the temples became the builders of man's democratic destiny. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.